Keanu Reeves, as always, in a simple t-shirt and jeans, decided to spend the day like an ordinary person. He walked into an upscale shopping mall to buy a few items. The mall was filled with expensive brands and luxurious stores, but it seemed that this day wouldn't be as easy as he had expected. As Keanu approached the entrance, the security guard, Jackson, immediately noticed him. The actor's appearance didn't fit the place, too simple and unremarkable. The guard was in a bad mood after a morning confrontation with his colleagues and immediately decided that Keanu didn't belong there. "Documents," Jackson said, not even looking up and not giving Keanu a chance to explain. Keanu, unaccustomed to such situations, froze for a moment. He was used to people knowing his face and never being asked for documents. But this guard didn't seem interested in making any compromises. "What? Just a routine document check," Jackson said, adding sarcastically. "Or would you prefer to just leave?" Keanu tried to smile and stay calm, but this guard clearly wasn't backing down. "I don't understand how someone in your jeans could afford to be here. Do you expect me to believe that you're planning to buy yourself something for $1,000? Jackson said with a harsh tone. Keanu felt the tension rising within him. The situation was becoming increasingly absurd. He wasn't about to back down, and now it had become personal. Jackson had no right to treat him this way. "What if I told you I own this mall?" Keanu asked, trying to control his emotions. Jackson, not surprised by such a statement, continued to ignore him. "Oh, sure. Owner. Maybe a millionaire too, huh?" He sneered, thinking it was just another joke. "You're just trying to sneak in and stroll around the brands, telling us who has the right to be here." Jackson didn't seem ready to stop. He waved his arms around, displaying his power. There was no doubt in his actions. He was certain of his right, and no joke was going to throw him off track. "I told you, get out of here," Jackson said, stepping closer to Keanu and gesturing as if he was ready to physically remove him from the premises. But Keanu didn't back down. Instead of leaving or arguing, he took a step toward Jackson. This unexpected move made the guard wary. Keanu kept speaking calmly despite the escalation of the situation. "You don't understand. You really don't understand who you're talking to." Jackson paused for a moment but immediately gave in to his irritation and responded even more sharply. "What? More jokes? I'm not listening to your lies. Let's go. Get out of here." Keanu, feeling the situation getting out of control, knew he couldn't let it continue. He suddenly realized that this situation was important, not only for him but for the guard, who was blind to people. "I am the owner of this mall," Keanu calmly but firmly repeated. "I created this place, and you're kicking me out because I don't look the way you expect me to." Jackson stood, trying to process what Keanu had just said. It was the moment when his confidence began to melt away. He couldn't believe that the person standing before him could actually change the whole system. "Owner," Jackson repeated, his face turning pale. He wanted to say something more, but the words wouldn't come. Keanu didn't wait for the guard to gather himself. He decided to act. "You were wrong, Jackson, but I'll give you a chance," Keanu said with a slight smile. After Keanu turned and walked into the mall, Jackson stood there, stunned and confused. He didn't know how to react to what had just happened. He was sure he had done everything right, that his actions were justified, but now he realized he had made a mistake. A mistake so big that he didn't even know what to do next. A few days passed and Jackson, despite his pride, couldn't forget that moment. It affected him more than he had thought. He couldn't even look his colleagues in the eye. He felt ashamed of his behavior, but pride wouldn't allow him to admit his mistake. Everything changed in one moment when he received an invitation. Expecting punishment, Jackson nervously approached the meeting place with Keanu. But instead of receiving a reprimand, he found himself in an unexpected situation. "I invited you here so you could learn something important," Keanu said, sitting in a cafe. "You showed that there's something important you don't understand." I want you to become part of my team." Jackson, still stunned, couldn't believe his ears. His life had just taken a 180-degree turn. "You'll work with me, but not as just a security guard. You'll be my partner, my friend, the one who watches over order, but without cruelty. You'll work in a place where people will see you not just as a guard, but as a person." Keanu continued speaking, and Jackson felt his world changing. This was an opportunity he couldn't miss. Jackson couldn't believe that his life had changed in one morning. Everything he had known before suddenly seemed foreign to him. He had become part of Keanu's team, but that didn't mean he could relax. On the contrary, now his task was much more complicated. Not just being a guard, but becoming an unnoticed but important person in the team, overseeing security and maintaining order, but in a completely new role. The first assignment was a real test for him. Keanu invited him to a public event where he was supposed to not only maintain order, but also be present without drawing unnecessary attention. It felt strange. While Jackson had always considered his work to be straightforward and clear, now he had to blend into the background, hidden behind the eyes of passers-by, working without words. They arrived at a social reception where Keanu was again the center of attention. There were many people around him, and it was important for Jackson to remain unnoticed while keeping an eye on everything. He felt responsible like never before, but still felt uneasy. "Remember, Jackson," Keanu said when they entered the hall, "your main task today is to stay in the shadows. Be alert, but don't interfere. We're not here to attract attention." Jackson nodded, but questions arose in his mind. He looked at all these familiar faces, the arrogant businessmen exchanging business talk, and the famous people who couldn't stop smiling for the cameras. He was part of this world, but at the same time, he didn't feel like he belonged in it. Throughout the evening, Jackson watched how Keanu interacted with people, joked and laughed, despite the obvious tension. Everything was perfect, except for one thing. Toward the end of the evening, Jackson noticed a group of people standing in the corner, discussing something that was clearly not in Keanu's favor. Jackson couldn't make out the words, but his intuition told him the situation was becoming tense. He started moving toward them, trying not to draw attention. But his instincts, the ones he had always relied on, told him that things might get out of control. He approached closer and overheard a few phrases that confirmed his suspicions. "If we don't stop him, we're going to have problems," said one of the men in the group, and Jackson felt his heart begin to race. Keanu didn't notice the threat, continuing to interact with others, but Jackson realized that if the situation didn't change, it could end badly. He quietly moved toward Keanu and, coming up from behind, gently warned him. "We have a problem. These people are discussing something unpleasant. We need to leave." Keanu noticed the caution in his voice and, without hesitation, agreed, "You're right. Let's go." Jackson felt the tension in his neck. They couldn't let anyone find out what these people had planned. At that moment, his role became clear. He had to protect not only Keanu, but also help him avoid complicated situations, staying unnoticed. Keanu and Jackson quickly left the hall, but Jackson felt that their steps were being watched. They were leaving through the side door, and Jackson noticed how the group of people he had overheard earlier followed them. It was the moment when he realized that there was much more behind them than he had thought. "Hurry," Keanu whispered when Jackson saw a few unfamiliar faces beginning to approach. They quickened their pace. But at the exit, they were met with an unpleasant surprise. The group of people, the same ones who had been discussing them, stood in the shadows, blocking their way. "Sorry, but you're not leaving so easily," said one of the men, grinning as he approached. Jackson immediately stepped in front of Keanu, preparing for an unexpected confrontation. But Keanu stopped him with a gesture. "Wait, Jackson," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. "I knew it would be like this. Don't worry, this is just business." Jackson's eyes flashed with surprise. He never thought people like this could be so decisive and dangerous. But Keanu seemed unafraid. He was ready for this. "If you want to talk, let's do it on a more civilized level," Keanu suggested, taking a step forward. But his words seemed to have no effect on the people standing in front of them. They continued moving forward. Suddenly, one of the men pulled out a mobile phone and started recording something. Jackson felt the tension rise. He knew that if the situation didn't resolve quickly, it would be over. Keanu seemed to remain calm, but inside, he realized everything could change in an instant. "You think I don't know who you are?" Keanu said, his voice firm. "We're all playing the same game, but only one of us will come out on top." The man with the phone stopped recording, and his expression changed. He threw the phone on the ground, breaking it. "You don't understand who you're dealing with, Reeves," said one of the men. "This mall isn't yours anymore." But Keanu, still smiling, said, "I'd like to hear that from you. We're not done with this conversation." Jackson, not understanding exactly what had just happened, was ready to intervene, but Keanu kept his hand on his shoulder. "They don't know who I really am. It's time for them to find out." With each step, Keanu and Jackson felt the danger creeping closer. But Keanu was ready for any turn of events. Jackson was with him, and this wasn't just cooperation. It was trust. And now, despite the threats, they were ready to continue the fight, not afraid of what lay ahead. The entire atmosphere around them became as tense as a bowstring. Keanu and Jackson stood face to face with a group of strangers who turned out to be much more dangerous than they had thought. The air was thick with tension. Every step they took could be decisive. There was no fear in the eyes of their opponents, only the certainty that they controlled the situation. But Keanu felt something else. He couldn't afford to let them know that he was nervous too. He knew that now every step, every glance mattered, but Jackson couldn't hide his anxiety. He was prepared for a confrontation with disgruntled clients or hooligans, but this was completely different. He felt small, as though he were standing in the middle of something far more terrifying than just a fight for the mall. His heart was pounding, and he felt the fear creeping in despite all his efforts to remain calm. "You think I don't know who you are?" said one of the men with an icy tone. His gaze was cold and confident, as if he were ready for any turn of events. "But you and your mall will soon be a thing of the past." Keanu didn't say a word. He looked at these people, but his thoughts were focused on what he needed to do next. He knew that if he lost control now, everything they had built would be at risk. "You don't understand who you're playing with," he said quietly but confidently, despite the internal tension. Jackson noticed how the man with the phone suddenly aimed the camera in their direction. That could only mean one thing. They were preparing to record the conflict and use it against them. Jackson instinctively took a step forward, but Keanu gently stopped him with a soft gesture. "Don't, Jackson," he said in a quiet but firm voice. "We're not on a battlefield. We're in a game, and our strength lies in being able to face danger without falling for the provocations." Jackson felt the pressure building in his chest. Keanu was right, but the further they went, the more obvious one fact became. Everything happening wasn't a coincidence. These people weren't just competitors. They were part of something bigger, and their attack could only be the beginning. One of the men took a step forward, his face grim and focused. He looked at Jackson and Keanu, as if assessing their weak spots. Jackson felt his shoulders tense. He was ready to protect Keanu at all costs, but he understood that in this game, physical strength wasn't always enough. Keanu was more than just the owner of the mall, and Jackson was beginning to realize that much more was at stake. "You still won't win," said the man who looked like the leader of the group. "You understand, your mall isn't the only thing we can take." Keanu met his gaze. He knew that these words weren't just threats. There were real intentions behind them, and if they didn't stop these people, everything they had built would be at risk. but Keanu remained calm, even though his heart was beating faster. "You want something from me, so let's do this honestly," he said. "I'm not afraid to fight, but I'm not going to be part of your show. You want power, you want to intimidate me? Well, try." His words were clear, and Jackson, watching him, realized that Keanu wasn't just trying to win this game, he was challenging them. This wasn't just about saving the mall. It was a battle to remain human in a world full of betrayal and manipulation. The man with the phone raised the camera again, and now Keanu decided it was enough. He stepped forward and said, "Go ahead, record. But remember one thing. What you're trying to do has consequences." At that moment, Jackson felt his anxiety turn into resolve. He was ready to support Keanu, even if it meant going against everyone. They couldn't let these people win. Meanwhile, the man with the phone pulled out one more thing, a document with something written on it that immediately caught Keanu's attention. He held it out toward Keanu. "You want to talk about consequences? Then take a look at this," he said with a smirk. The document was offensive, as if they had prepared a plan to expose Keanu and his business. But what alarmed Keanu the most was that among these documents were signatures he recognized. He looked at Jackson. For a moment, it seemed like they were both trapped. These people knew what they were doing. They knew what they were planning. And now they had to act. Quickly. "This is none of your business," Keanu replied, showing no signs of fear. "I'll handle this myself." Jackson felt his anxiety return, but with every word Keanu spoke, he demonstrated that it didn't matter what was in the document. What mattered was how they would deal with it. Keanu stepped toward the men and, with cold determination, said, "Things are changing now. We won't let you destroy what we've built." The eyes of the men flickered with surprise, but it quickly turned into anger. "You won't be able to hold on to this," said the leader, now clearly angry. "You won't have the strength. You'll lose." Keanu simply smiled. "Not this time." At that moment, something in the atmosphere changed. The opponents began to realize they had encountered a much more serious player than they had expected. Keanu wasn't just the owner of the mall. He was someone who knew how to fight without drawing unnecessary attention. He was ready for any manipulation, but they hadn't counted on him being so resolute. Jackson stood nearby, not knowing what to do. From time to time, he raised his gaze to look at Keanu, but Keanu showed no signs of concern. He knew they had to see this through to the end. "Do you really think they'll just leave?" Jackson said, closely watching the movements of the enemies. He couldn't hide his anxiety, his voice trembling. He had grown used to regular threats, but this was different. This was personal. Keanu sighed and looked at Jackson. He understood that Jackson was worried, that he was conflicted. Jackson was ready to go to the end, but he didn't yet know what he could lose in this fight. Keanu himself felt that uncertainty, but he knew he couldn't show weakness. "Did you think they would just leave?" Keanu asked. "These people didn't come here for money or power. They came to destroy everything we've built." Jackson nodded. He understood that he wasn't just guarding the mall anymore. He was now standing beside Keanu, not as a subordinate, but as part of this fight, and just when it seemed everything had quieted down, the man who had been silent all this time took a step forward and extended a piece of paper to Keanu. It was a draft, but the words on it made Jackson's blood run cold. "You don't understand who's behind this," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "It's not just you and your mall. It's much bigger than that." Keanu grabbed the paper, showing no emotion, but inside, everything tightened. He glanced at the text and his eyes narrowed. "I knew it wasn't that simple," he said quietly, tearing the paper into pieces. "You want to know who I am? I'm the one who's been behind this from the very beginning." Now everything became clear. The opponents weren't just competitors. They were part of a bigger game, in which Keanu was not only the owner of the mall, but a player in a much more complex network. The people he was dealing with were just pawns on the board, but behind them stood a force he hadn't expected to face. Jackson noticed how Keanu had changed. Just a few minutes ago, his face had been calm, but now he looked alert, almost worried. Jackson wanted to ask what exactly Keanu had seen in that document, but he didn't dare. He felt his heart beating faster and a lump of fear formed in his chest. "You can't just break this network," Jackson said, trying to understand what was happening. "If this is really that important, we need to know who we're dealing with." Keanu lifted his gaze to Jackson. In his eyes there was uncertainty, but also determination. "They're playing with us, but we won't let them win. We know what they're planning, and now we need to act," he said. Jackson felt his knees weaken as he realized their opponents weren't just people with money. They were part of something more terrifying and powerful than he could have imagined. "What do we do?" Jackson asked, his voice full of anxiety. He was ready to fight to the end, but he knew they needed to plan every step. Keanu took a deep breath and said, "We'll play by their rules, but on our terms. It's time to put an end to this game." Keanu and Jackson began to act, but now they were more cautious than ever. They started gathering information about their enemies, finding out who was behind the conspiracy and how it all connected to their business. They didn't have much time, and Keanu knew that every move they made could be decisive. Several days passed, and one evening, when they had nearly uncovered all the details about their opponents, Keanu approached Jackson with troubling news. "We have information. We know who's behind this. It's the same people trying to take over our mall. But there's one more important detail. They don't just want to destroy us. They want to do it publicly. They want to show everyone that they can control any situation." Jackson felt cold sweat run down his back. This was no longer just a threat to the business. This was a matter of their personal safety. They could lose everything. Keanu couldn't allow this to be their end. "We won't let them do this," he said with determination. "I built this mall, and I'm not going to let them destroy it." Jackson nodded, realizing that now it was much more personal than just a fight for money. This was a battle for everything they had built, and for their future. Evening came, and Keanu, Jackson, and their team began preparing for the final step. They knew their opponents wouldn't stop, and now they needed to not just win, but prove they were stronger. Keanu stood in front of the mirror and looked at his reflection. He was ready, but there was not only determination on his face, but also signs of exhaustion. He knew this would be a tough fight, but he also knew he couldn't back down. "Are you ready?" Jackson asked, approaching Keanu. "Ready. We can't lose," Keanu replied, his voice firm, but there was a hidden anxiety in it. The final meeting loomed on the horizon. Keanu and Jackson knew this was their last chance. They had all the information, all the evidence, and they were ready to make the decisive move. The opponents who had been trying to destroy them were now on the brink of defeat. Keanu and Jackson met their enemies in one of the city's most prestigious halls. Here, among the luxury and the many watching eyes, they would face those who had been trying to destroy everything Keanu had created. But Keanu was ready. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to win. "You tried to play with fire, but now you understand that there will be a price to pay," Keanu said, his voice firm and resolute. The leaders of the opponents, knowing that everything had been exposed, began to get nervous. In their hands, there was nothing left but empty threats. Keanu knew he had won. Now, all that was left was to carry out this final act with dignity. In response to Keanu's words, one of their opponents attempted to pull out the documents they had prepared to compromise Keanu. But Keanu, easily anticipating this move, handed all the evidence over to the authorities, giving these people a chance for a real lesson. When the documents were officially exposed and their connection to criminal activities became evident, the opponents found themselves trapped. Under the pressure of the accusations, they realized that their entire scheme had collapsed. Keanu, knowing that victory was already in his hands, didn't continue the proceedings. He left them alone with the consequences of their actions, knowing that their influence had come to an end. Jackson, who was by his side, couldn't believe how quickly and efficiently everything had been resolved. "You did it," Jackson said, looking at Keanu with respect. Keanu nodded. He knew that with one more step, they could return to their normal lives. Everything he had built was saved. When the opponents were completely exposed and their plans ruined, Keanu returned to his center. He felt that his struggle was over, and now he could look to the future with a clear heart. The business was thriving again, and no threat could stop it. "We won," Keanu said, standing on the balcony and looking at the city, which now seemed much brighter to him. Jackson, standing next to him, smiled. He felt his fears vanish, replaced by a new understanding. He had become part of something much bigger. And his journey with Keanu was only the beginning of a new life. The victory was not just in restoring the center. The victory was that Keanu and Jackson had proven that even in the most difficult situations, one can succeed if they stay true to themselves. Keanu, having become the victor in this game, knew that he and Jackson could get through anything.